Good morning. How is everyone? So this is the introduction part 2. In our first video introduction, we looked at the nuts and bolts of the course and a little bit about what we were going to cover. We talked about really 3 primary things. We talked about just getting familiar with a work of literature. We talked about learning about the process of reading and interpretation. And then we talked about some of the historical context involved in situating these stories so that we can better understand why they speak the way they do and why they speak about what they speak about. Today, what I want to do is focus very specifically, this class is great works of world literature, and I want to hammer home each point. What do we mean by great? What do we mean by the world? And what do we mean by literature? Right? And on one hand, these totally self-evident, important works of writing, poetry, the novel, the Bible, things of that nature, coming from all around the world. But there are some more nuanced meanings of these words that we should keep in mind, number one, and that we'll look at. And number two, the very concept of world literature is by its very nature a modern idea, such that if you lived in ancient Greece, if you were a Christian or a Jew in the ancient Middle East, there would be no notion of world literature. First of all, the chances that any works, the chances that things were actually written down, or every work written down, of course, not the case. That it would even be in your language. So, of course, the only language that you'd likely know, the average person, is your own native language, and then there's likely a chance that you might not even be able to read your own language. So, in many cases, these stories come out of oral traditions, and they are tied to specific languages, which are obviously languages are tied to specific groups of people. So in the ancient world, you wouldn't be learning world literature, you'd be learning your literature, which becomes a gateway or a frame to how you or lens to how you understand the whole world around you, right? And it would have been unintelligible. I mean, really, in many ways, it would have been unintelligible to people only 400 years ago to talk about something like world literature for the most part, because they'd be concerned with the literature of their people. Talk about the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. The Muslims have a very, in the Quran, they have a very lovely expression for Jews and Christians. Also applies to Muslims themselves, but they use it particularly to talk about the Jews. They talk about the people of the book, which is to say the Jews are the people of the Hebrew Bible. So the central text and story that they'd be concerned with in the course of their life, their contact with literature, would have been one book, right? Not many from all over the world. So this very notion of course, dealing with world literature speaks to a certain cosmopolitan attitude that what education should do is broadly expose us to kind of key works of literature throughout the world, rather than simply works that speak to our specific rooted identity in a specific time and place. But you could really flip that around and simply say that, this cosmopolitan approach, cosmopolitan means to be a citizen of the world, right? So New Yorkers are cosmopolitan because they're exposed to a lot of different things and they see a lot of different ways of life. And the antithesis is someone who's parochial, who's kind of rooted in you say, like out in the country or Appalachia or something like that, where they're not exposed to different ways of life. But you might just say that our parochial way of life is to expect to be cosmopolitan, exposed to a broad range of different types of literature, such as in the ancient world, that these things would seem totally alien to us. Okay. So then what I want to focus on is not just what literature is, but why. Why most of literature, whether it's poetry, whether it's the novel, even Plato's the philosophic dialogues that we'll look at later in the course, the Bible, form of poetry, they all do one thing, almost exclusively and invariably, one way or another, is they tell stories. They tell stories. So at the end of this lecture, what I'd really like to ask and try to answer is, why stories? Why do we tell stories? Because the crucial thing is that we tell stories not only to each other, but we tell stories to ourselves, from ourselves to ourselves, and of course we tell stories in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different formats and genres. We tell stories in the newspaper, we tell stories in a religious text, we tell stories in a novel, we tell stories over the water cooler or what have you, right? And the question is, why do we do that? What is, if we do it, and it's so pervasive as it of course is, it serves a really foundational and fundamental function. And I'm going to argue that that function sits at the root of literature in general and also great literature. And then we also want to make the claim that obviously, just state the obvious, that telling stories has something to do with the fact that human beings speak, right? There is no Homer of the dogs. There is no Moses of the dogs. There is no Maya Angelou of the kitty cats, right? It's only human beings who tell stories because we have language, and it seems to be the case that one of the fundamental usages or functions of language is not just to communicate raw data, but to tell stories. And a story is a very specific form, you could say, of information, right? But I mean, we live in a world of information, but the books we're going to read are not just information. And we can talk more about why I'm saying that. It sounds kind of odd. Okay, so let's begin and start unpacking these words. So what are great works of literature? I have no clue, right? You come to this question with a fresh mind. Let's state the obvious. It's what schools and academics teach, right? Literature. We all know what literature is. We're sitting in a drawing room with leather-bound chairs and a brandy and a pipe, and or we're sipping our tea with our pinkies up in the air. When I think of literature, I think of something very pretentious and something I want to have nothing to do with, right? With the old leather-bound books, and you smell like the leather and the paper and all this stuff. One really important thing we should keep in mind about any decent work of literature that you ever read is that that author did not write that book to be read and analyzed and taught in a classroom so students can get a grade. These books, they serve the function of living and breathing for human beings. They have an immediate life function, trying to grapple with the meanings of our life, and are not merely academic objects. That's really crucial. That's not to say that they didn't intend them to be studied in careful ways because they had put so much into them that the only way you get all that meaning out of them is to spend time, passionate time, right? And when I think of the kind of time and energy and effort spent to really invest in a great work of literature, it's a lot like people I see on the subway who take out their Bible while they're riding, and it's very clear that they have read this book hundreds of times, and they've marked off pages, and the book is dog-eared, and you're asking yourself, what are they doing? What are they doing? Haven't they read that chapter and verse 100,000 times? Don't they know it? Well, the answer is no, because a great work of literature is kind of fundamentally elusive, and it changes as you change. The more experiences you have in your life, the more you're able to understand a great work. Because, I mean, very often, if you're, say, a teenager, you might be very precocious and interested in reading all kinds of challenging works, philosophy, novel, what have you. The problem is you could be a genius, but the point is you have not had the experience that the book is bringing forth and talking about, trying to communicate. So books grow as you grow, and you always have to come back to them because the more experience you have, the more you start teasing out new meanings that are in that text. So, if we take this really simple definition of literature, the kind of common definition everyone's familiar with, what does it consist of? It consists actually of a lot of stuff. Poetry, drama, novels, history, philosophy, biography, the essay, all these different forms or genres of literature, different types, formats that are asking different questions, have a different function, and have different styles or ways of writing. In a class like this, or in a great works class, all of these forms would be included, which is the wonderful thing. We typically think of the literature as novel, but really we might think of any great work of writing that meets a certain threshold of significance and value and meaning and literary merit can be worthy of a class like this, or of the idea of literature, right? What is literature? Entire body of writings of a specific language, period, people, or etc. So you think about like French literature, or German literature, or English literature, or literature of the 18th century, a body of literature built around whether it's a language, or whether it's the zeitgeist, or the important events of a time period. Another way to think about it. Last one, and very significant, particularly for our point of view, and I stress this because I think we live in a world in which we've really lost this, particularly as a collective phenomenon, not so much as an individual one, but certainly as a collective. Texts which express the identity of a people. They don't just express the identity of a people, but in the process of people learning them, reading them, reciting them, having them taught to them, these texts make people. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a Muslim? What does it mean to be a philosopher, or many other things? I suppose any academic discipline, or even a lawyer. What does it mean to be a Jew? It means you've internalized the stories of the Hebrew Bible, and they shape and make your outlook, right? And of course, one of the fascinating things is we typically think of religion as simply spelling out rules of life. The Ten Commandments, Jesus' principle of love thy neighbor as thyself, or the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have done to yourself. But for example, when you really turn to these texts, and this is of course even true of the New Testament with the story of Jesus, what you find is that they're stories, and that their meanings are rather ambiguous, and that one has to really internalize. But the important thing here is that these books shape not just individuals, but they shape communities, and they become the very thing that makes the community a community, or I should say a group of people, into a community. What is a community? Very specific meaning to this word. It's a group of people who are bound by something fundamental in common, like religion, like nationality, something that is strong enough, that creates strong enough ties to actually bring them together in a community where they have a sense of obligations and responsibilities to one another. And the book, the Bible, which is, of course, what does the Bible mean? It just means the book, right? Because it's the only one you need. It is the one that not only tells you who you are, it makes you who you are, and it doesn't just make you who you are, but it makes an entire community of believers. And what the book is doing there is establishing a common orientation, a common outlook on the world. And I think if there's one thing you see in our world, at least superficially, is a tremendous sense of almost a kind of like intellectual anarchy. To raise the question, and moral anarchy. What do we hold in common? What is the identity that defines us and brings us together? That's the challenge. So, what does the word literature mean? Book learning, right? So we're going to actually go back in time here. But in the 15th century, in the English language, literature meant book learning, knowledge gained from books, right? And this is really interesting. So therefore, someone who is literate is someone who is engaged in a substantial amount of book learning. Typically, when we modern 21st century Americans, Democrats, when we think about literacy, we think about simply the ability to read. Historically, the word literacy and literature, literacy meant not simple ability to read. It meant being conversant with the great texts. So, for example, if you're Shakespeare, he had a tremendous knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman literature, the Renaissance literature of Italy, and of course also the Bible. And all of this influenced what went into his plays, the language, the ideas, the tropes. So therefore, a literate person, when they came to Shakespeare's plays, they could tease out the subtle allusions or references to things like Roman history, to things like, I don't know, the Passion of Jesus, or basic language, or a story from the Old or the New Testament, and so on and so forth. Which is to say, these are all little kernels of meaning that if you're not literate, if you're not conversant in these standard great works, right, they're things you're going to miss in the text. We should also say this, why a great literature course? Because it's fundamentally connected with a liberal education, right? And the first thing we think of when we think of a liberal education is we think of a broad and well-rounded education, right? And that certainly is true, but that's actually a kind of derivative fact from something more fundamental about what the word liberal originally meant, right? So let's say this. The university, in its traditional understanding, and it still has varying degrees of truth today, was determined to give a liberal education, which is why, for example, you are compelled to take classes that are mandatory and that they're not necessarily connected with your major, because the goal of an undergraduate education, in contradistinction to a graduate education, was to give you a broad base of knowledge, understanding, and thought, rather than a very narrow specialization. Now, why liberal and why broad, right? It has to do with human nature. It has to be broad because human beings have a diverse set of mental faculties, and the goal of education is to develop you, yourself, your mind, your spirit, your soul, however you want to think about it. All those words have slightly different connotations to them that I think are all valuable, right? To develop you as a whole human being, right? And you have different components. You have a body and a soul. You have a soul that has reason. You have a soul that has emotions and different types of emotions. You have an intellect with different types of intellectual capacities, whether it's working with words, whether it's working with numbers, different types of reasoning, and therefore all the different disciplines of the university, singular, it's all united, and it's united in the human being because it is a manifestation of all those different facets of the whole human being. To be well-rounded is to have the whole thing developed. And then lastly, liberal is the education appropriate to the free human being. And we get in here issues of the ancient world and into the modern world of slavery, which is that it was understood that the slave intellectually, for the most part, was not entitled to an education of the mind, and even people who were not slaves, who did things like manual labor, their labor was called the arts, the mechanical arts, like bricklaying or something like that. And they were called the slavish arts. The arts becoming of the slave. Why? Because they use the body and not the mind. And obviously liberal education is designed to develop the mind and all parts of it. But liberal literally means free. It's the education becoming of a free person, and it's the free person who can fully develop their capacities for, among other things, genuinely free thought. So the goal of a liberal education is to develop a truly free person. And when we use the word free here, we don't just mean politically free, like we have civil rights and we're protected under law to do what we want for the most part. But what we mean is cognitively or psychologically free. And if you don't have an understanding of what that means, I encourage you, because we're not going to read it in this class, to read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, who was a slave, and his liberation from slavery, as he clearly explains in his autobiography, consisted of two feats. One, physically liberating himself from the chains of slavery and running away from the Maryland area up north and escaping. But his ability to do that was really predicated on a psychological liberation and an understanding that, given what he was as a human being, he was meant for more than being just a slave and a physical laborer at the mercy and will of another human being, right? And part of the strategy of slavery was to keep slaves cognitively, mentally in the dark, to keep them unaware of the possibilities of their own life, that they could be anything more than victims of the system, and try to actually show them that they should be content with what they have. And Frederick Douglass was a man, an incredibly insightful man, who understood kind of intuitively the way in which slavery was not consistent with his own nature as a human being. But it also took, once he liberated himself physically, a lot of reading to explain to himself why a free life is the just and appropriate life for a human being. The argument sounds obvious because, of course, slavery is wrong. We all know that. The question is why. The question is why. So, a free person versus a slave, there's physical slavery and political slavery, but here we're talking about slavery and freedom from an intellectual point of view, right? And free speech, the ability to speak and think freely and be liberally educated, has everything to do with a kind of genuine freedom of thought that is not easily gained and requires some courage. Okay, so book learning. One more point we should make here. Up until the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the text was the world. If you wanted to understand something about the world, there was a kind of, just call it a cultural disposition or maybe a bias toward the text as the source of knowledge. This is also something very different for us. For us, if we want knowledge, we know that we go straight to the world. Or maybe we just turn on the internet. Maybe it's the internet has become the world. The internet has become our version of the text. But there were many thinkers coming out of the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance and then into what's the period of the scientific revolution, who began, they were literate people. Now we know what that word means in its full sense. Very literate people, but they started to reject book learning in favor of the evidence of the senses. And one of the stories we're going to talk about today is the demotion of literature as a source of knowledge, as a source of truth, and how it was displaced by other things, namely natural science, right? So the politicians come on and say, I'm going to trust the science. So one of the questions we're actually going to answer here is, how did we go from trusting a book like the Bible to trusting the science, right? Okay, literature comes from letters, right? And we think of a man of letters, and here I don't mean the letters that you write, I mean literally alphabet, right? So it is rooted in writing, right? And so during the Renaissance and after that, you have 18th century France, men of letters, right? They are the workers who work with words and their minds and their souls rather than their bodies, right? So what is great literature? I think there's some key characteristics. One, it's writings that tackle the highest and most perplexing, challenging, fascinating themes. They express the permanent and universal themes and ideas of human experience. In our age of difference, in our age of identity politics, in which we overstate and ground all of our understanding of everyone else in the way in which we're different, I think it's absolutely crucial that we stress the profound commonalities that human beings experience in their life, their desires, their needs, their conflicts, their challenges, their dilemmas, what have you, life and death. We all go through it. It's the same for everybody. So works that tackle challenging themes, right? It's like the line, what is it? Something easy to get is not really worth having, right? Because it doesn't have the same investment. You can only write a great work when you take on the most challenging topics. What is great literature? Kind of academic answer. The core canon of books which constitute the total spectrum of human experience and provide a genuinely liberal education. So the great works, while they do deal with a common humanity, no doubt you get different, what I like to think of as not fundamental differences, but different facets of the same nature. Obviously, people who are raised in a culture here, in this time and place, versus one raised here in this time and place, their humanity is going to emerge differently. But you take all these different books with different perspectives that don't agree with one another about the most fundamental things. This is where liberal education and free speech come in. Here I'm going to read a book that tells me this is what it's all about. And then I'm going to read a book here that's equally powerful to me, but it gives me a completely opposite answer. The great works, the great thinkers don't agree, and the great writers do not agree about what is important and what human life is all about, right? And what's more joyous and enjoyable than getting exposed to all these different opinions. Free speech is ultimately about the ability for different opinions to percolate and propagate so we can address the problems of life, right? Because one person's solution is not another person's solution. Great literature is what you read compared to what you don't. Harold Bloom will make the argument that we're reading against the clock. We're reading against the clock. And therefore, you're born, you die, you only have so much time, you might as well read something substantial rather than eating mental Doritos or putting mental Doritos in your mind, right? Pop culture is great. It has the perfect amount of sugar, salt, fat, sex, and just gobbledygook going on all the time. And it's like a mental magnet. Just our brains and minds and eyes are fixated on pop culture because they know how to press all the buttons of your attention span. But it's all crap, and I might even make an argument that it's worse than crap. Some of the things I see in pop culture, I'm actually pretty terrified by, and I find, and I say this as a father of a 6-year-old, and I say, what kind of world is my daughter actually growing up in? And she's 6, but I can see the messages being purveyed that she can't see, and I can also see the implications of them from a lot of pop culture. Would you really want to base your boy-girl relationships on a Lady Gaga song? Have you ever listened to the words of a Lady Gaga song? I mean, I find it downright terrifying, right? Depressing isn't, the depression music, I'm like a sad teenager, I get that. But this is like almost kind of twisted and demonic. I can't imagine. Plato had the powerful observation that what really educates the people of a nation, of a city-state, what have you, is their popular culture. And our popular culture is perfect. And, you know, I'm not a Puritan. I am curious about all kinds of things. But I have to say our popular culture is, you have to question the fiber of a people who are being perpetually exposed to the kind of pop culture. And therefore, an alternative is the great works. And they deal with sordid topics too, but they have a different approach to them. So taste is a matter of opinion, quality is a matter of fact. So the first thing everybody will tell me is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and a great work is because I like it and you don't, or a great work is because one culture has said theirs work is better, their books are better than another, and all this stuff. And we can have that argument until we're blue in the face. But the bottom line is there are great works of art, great works of literature that have had lives invested in them, right? There's a great story, and it's a true story, about a painter, Whistler, who was an American living in Great Britain, and there was an art critic who had written a piece in the paper about his painting, and he said he acted as if it was dashed off, and like paint was just spilled on the canvas, and that's how he made the painting. And Whistler actually took him to court for libel, and this was mostly kind of a publicity stunt. And they asked him, how long did it take for him to make the painting? And it turned out, he said, yeah, I made it in a day, but it represented a life worth of work. That one day or so many hours of working really had in it the work of a lifetime, right? So you see quality in works that show evidence of work of a lifetime. And despite all our relativism, the more you read, the more you expose yourself and cultivate your judgment, the more you realize what Count Basie said, the great big band leader from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. He said there's good music and there's everything else. There's good music and there's everything else. He's being very nice there, right? He says there's shit, right? And you don't want to read it. You don't want to waste your life with it. Not worth it. Okay. So what is the world in world literature, right? And there's a tension between the world and a world, between the objective reality of the world and our subjective experience of it. There is the world, the world we all know and operate in the same world, and there's just one of them. But each of us has a world, a certain perspective on the totality, which gives us each our own distinct horizon of experience. Why is this important? Because books talk about the world from a particular point of view and therefore represent a world. Now, on one hand, world literature refers to works that come from all over the world, but there are other connotations to this word that are important, because all of them, particularly in the ancient world, will make claims about what there is in the world. And of course, they all don't agree about how the world came to be, what it's all about, what does it consist of, what is it like, and so on and so forth, right? So the world could be the cosmos or the universe at large, right? This is an interesting word that has multiple shades of meaning, right? It doesn't necessarily just mean the planet. It could mean the whole gestalt, as I like to say. Or the world could refer more specifically to the experience of an individual of a community, which is to say, my world or our world. And as this word was used 16th, 17th century in English, the word world very explicitly marries, you might say, the objective to the subjective. The objective meaning the objective reality of the world versus our subjective experience from our particular perspective on the world. And what is any great work of literature or any great work of art? It's a synthesis. It's a synthesis of our point of view as it connects and interfaces with the world out there, including the people in it. Here we've got the got the same text here, but I show you an image on the right of the Globe Theater, which is where Shakespeare had his plays performed. And the Globe Theater, which we'll talk about later in the semester when we look at Othello, Shakespeare's Othello, was intended to be a microcosm of the world, a mini world, because everything that happened in it, everything that happened in the plays, encapsulated all the various dimensions of the human experience as we live in the world and have our worldview shaped by it. So here's another image of the Globe Theater, and of course it's circular, to reiterate the circularity of the globe, but also to reiterate the circle being an image of totality. What is in the world? The world contains everything, and the circle, going back to the ancient world, is this symbol, this all-encompassing symbol of totality, right? So it has every element in it. And, what does the Bible, or what does Homer in the Odyssey purport to show? They purport to show, in a kind of encyclopedic way, encapsulate the entirety of the world in one book, as if such a thing were even possible, right? So, what is the world? Life on earth. This world, as opposed to the next, you start seeing there's two worlds. There's this world and there's the other world. In the hereafter, in heaven, wherever it might be found. In 1200, the known world, right? And of course, 1200 and a few hundred years later, what the known world consists of changes, and it changes everybody's understanding of the world as people like Magellan and Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci start exploring the world. John Cook, they start discovering new places, and they have to reconceive of what they think the world really is. And of course, America, it's the new world, right? The physical universe in the broadest sense, right? The world, this is interesting. Also, human existence and the affairs of life. This is what matters to us, right? I mean, do we really care about, outer space? What's in outer space? Space. What's space? It's nothing. It's not interesting, right? So, for example, when we look at Genesis, chapters 1 and 2, chapter 1 will deal with the world in terms of the totality of the cosmos and its order, what's in it and its structure, right? And the human being has a very tiny and subordinate place within this whole scheme. But then in chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis, we get to the human world, which is simply another meaning of the word. World meaning human existence, the affairs of our life. What do we really care about? We care about the affairs of human life, the cosmos and what's the radioactive waves that are flying through, outer space don't mean much to us, right? So actually in books, the opening chapters of Genesis, you see this transition from the world of the cosmos to the world of human beings, or we might say in an old-fashioned way, the world of man, which was just used to be a word for human beings, men, women, and everybody else who are human beings genetically. The word world comes from German, right? Wer, it means man, right? And it's connected, words for men connected with virile, virtue, and also alt, meaning age, right? Growth and development. So the world refers to the world of mankind and its perspective on the cosmos, and maybe even a process of development or cycles of life. So actually one of the founders of world literature was the 18th century German poet Goethe. And he had an idea that world literature would reflect different world views of different groups of people. And they have this wonderful term in German, and it's a term that is found in Hegel and really key to his thinking, Weltanschauung, Weltanschauung, world view, right? Effectively, what we've been saying is that the very concept of world has implied in it our particular view, our perspective, our subjective understanding of the world, or our horizon. And horizon is a beautiful metaphor. You find it in Nietzsche, another German philosopher, in that we don't see the earth as a totality. We only see a facet, or if you will, a horizon of it that colors our understanding and situates us in only a particular fraction of the whole totality of human experience. So different worldviews can be based on different things. They can be based on geography, and of course all these things are tied together in real life with one another. Geography, civilization, culture, political nations, different points of view, different worlds, different linguistic groups, right? Religion, ethnic, moral, ethical, and issues of justice, and then the psychology of the individual. So literature reflects or creates my world, or our milieu. Our milieu is like the particular situation that we're in with its particular kind of subculture. And literature, in reflecting a world review, reflects the spirit of a people. And I think that's the appropriate term, because it captures all the kind of dimensions, psychological, material, and otherwise, in it. And so a Weltanschauung, very interesting, literally means war, world, and Anschauung literally means intuition. It's a kind of even like a divination. And the word Weltanschauung implies a kind of subjective reaction to the horizon of the world that I experience versus you, or the self experiences versus the other. So here's this wonderful image by Caspar David Friedrich. I think it's called The Wanderer or something like that. But it's him, and it's called, this is a great Rook's figure, where we're in his position. He's not facing us because he's looking out, and we're looking out at this landscape. So he occupies, in essence, our position on this horizon of this world, and you see that it suggests the way in which this vision of this landscape is really in part a product of his observation or viewing of it. So now we get to a really interesting question in terms of the function of literature. I think most people, when they think of literature, they think of fiction, right? And kind of fantasy and entertainment, potentially. World literature. Does literature explain the world? Does it represent the world? Or does it create the world, right? So here I've got this image of, God creating, heaven and earth, the whole cosmos. And then here we've got like the objective reality of the earth shot from a satellite, right? Representing the empirical facts of the thing, the material facts of the thing, right? And, we'll talk about this more, but it raises some profound questions about what words can do and what is the relationship between words and the world. Do words, or can words, simply represent the world, or are they creating realities, creating ideas beyond the simple given of the external world itself? Okay, so now we move into another question. And our question now is, why literature? And when we say why literature, what we're really saying is why narratives? What the hell's a narrative? Don't think too much. A narrative is just a story. So the question becomes, why do we tell stories? Why do we love to tell stories? and why do we habitually tell stories to ourselves and each other, and this becomes the very fabric of our kind of cognitive and you might say verbal or discursive existence. When every time we open our mouths, we're almost always telling some kind of story. And it's really interesting because if you think of art in general in its storytelling capacity, we spend, particularly as modern people with a lot of free time compared to prior ages of mankind, we spend a lot of time engaged with fictions, with the land of make-believe, right? When you sit down to watch a film, let's state the obvious. You're just watching flickering light on a screen, right? That's all it is, right? And yet we engage in the suspension of disbelief, and we take it really seriously as an experience that is almost akin to the reality of the world, or at least it has the power, or it has the potential to have the power and significance of our experience of the concrete world. And of course, sometimes stories and films and books and literature and what have you are much more engaging, right, than the everyday humdrum, work a day, I've got to go 9 to 5 and bust my butt, right? So why do we love to tell stories? What is the significance of that? Well, the first answer is really important. We are, it's a kind of awkward phrase, but we're an account-giving being who desire to explain the world to ourselves and explain the world to each other, right? And obviously the first condition of being an account-giving being is that we have language, right? Since we have language, we use it. And what do we use it for? Primarily to give accounts. What is an account? How am I using this? I'm not talking about your bank account, right? An account is just an explanation of something, right? The important thing to know about the stories we tell is that they're not just stories. They're explanations of things that we're trying to understand. Maybe it's explaining something that we weren't seeking to understand when we came to it, but we find out that the story is explaining something about our lives, our experience as human beings. Absolutely crucial. We have reason and speech, right? Obviously, let's talk about that for a second. Obviously, speech and reason, which is the ability to think and try to determine what's true or what's right. Yeah. Obviously, speech is brought about by an evolutionary change that gave us a distinct advantage, right, in the game of the survival of the fittest, right? The species evolved through genetic mutations and then mutations that advantage their fitness or ability to survive in the real world, in the game of survival of the fittest. So clearly language, we still have it, right? And we're still alive. So clearly language must have been instrumental in the survival of human beings. And we could make an argument that our ability to have language, number one, allows for us to think in new ways, right, that no other animal can think. And that ability to think and to speak allowed us to conquer the world. And one of the basic arguments of evolutionary biologists and historians in trying to explain how human beings became so dominant is that we are not the strongest, we're not the fastest, we don't see the best or don't smell the best. All of our senses and our physical capacities, with the exception of the use of our hands, is really diminished compared to most other animals. But what we do have is the ability to think and also to communicate, and therefore to coordinate our behavior with one another. And part of that coordination involves seeing ourselves as part of the same community. And particularly, obviously the first communities of human beings, human species, are genetic communities. the family, the tribe, the clan, right? I'm in an environment with my cousins and my grandmother and my children and my mother and my father and my brothers and the sisters. But when we get language, we get culture. We get ideas that are only passed through culture, not through genes, number one. And number two, we start living by ideas and principles and beliefs that bring us together, and they bring us together independent of who our parents were or who our ancestors were or what the color of our skin is, right? So if we say, you know, what binds together American society? Well, it's not a race. It's partly a language, but at the core of it are principles of, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, which meant human beings, were created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that those principles, those beliefs, those ideas are actually the things that bind us together in a community. And what does this allow us to do? It allows us to succeed in the game of life, right? Okay, so we're account-giving beings because we have brains and speech, and we want to use them, and we want to explain things to ourselves, and it's all part of our survival. And of course, it's also pleasurable. Why is it pleasurable? It's pleasurable because we have the ability, and when we're good at something, people like to use it. My daughter is good at X, Y, and Z, like athletically or academically, and she likes to do those things that she's good at, right? It's really pretty simple. So now I want to talk about a story is a narrative explanation of something, or a narrative is an explanation of something in the form of a story. And the question is, what is a story? What is a story, or what do you need to have for a story to be a story? Okay. So, what is a story? What makes a story, and what do you need to have? I would say there are three fundamental things you need to have. You need to have characters of some kind. And certainly you could have stories that don't involve human characters. You could have a story about the moon and the sun. But let me tell you, if it's a story about the moon and the sun, you're talking about characters who have some type of ongoing destiny. The next thing is you need change, right? So we could say this. We wake up on Monday morning and we sit and watch the grass for 5 days, and we go to sleep on Friday and the grass has grown. Is that a story? Well, of course somebody could say it's a story, but I'm just going to argue that it's not really a story. Something hasn't changed in any fundamental way, right? There isn't any fundamental difference, right? A story involves fundamental change, and the only way you get fundamental change is through a conflict and a potential resolution of a conflict, right? So therefore, it seems to be that characters of some kind going through a conflict that is going to drive the story, that is going to drive the dynamic of the story. If you think of the classic plot structure, the plot structure has to do with a series of events. You have rising and falling action. Well, what is that all about? That's all about changes, not just of pace, but also of fundamental things happening that change the characters or change their situation, one or the other, normally some kind of combination of the two. And what brings about the change? Conflict. So then we ask, why conflict? Well, it seems like conflict is the precipitator of change, number one. And number two, conflict seems to be so embedded in our lives that things don't happen unless there's a conflict. And conflict means things are happening. And if you think about if a story is somehow connected with human life and the trajectory of human life, what is life? What is getting up every day of the week but facing the latest conflict, however big or small, that one has to confront and do what? And resolve. when we face a conflict, we need to resolve it, or at least attempt to resolve it, because living is problem solving, or conflict. We're a problem solving animal. So therefore, every day, the arc of our day or the arc of our life is defined by confronting challenges and trying to solve them. And then, of course, a story has to be finite. There has to be a beginning, middle, and end, right? Can I sit down and write my autobiography and capture, because I want to capture the meaning of my life? Well, my life's not over. So in some sense, the answer is no. I can't capture the story of my life and its full meaning until I've reached the conclusion. So a story has some type of resolution. And of course, the resolution could be not one that's satisfying, or it could not resolve, the resolution could not resolve the conflict, right? But it has to be finite. I mean, what's the problem with existence? It goes on and on and on and on, and therefore, because it's not finite, it doesn't have a clear and distinct meaning. But once you can encapsulate things in a fixed story with a beginning, middle, and end, all of a sudden it has, it becomes a story and has clear meaning. Okay, another reason why narrative, because it seems to most basically reflect the human life cycle. We're born, we live, and we die. Dust to dust, right? And in the process of that, that creates a beginning, middle, and end. And we have a beginning, middle, and end because it's finite, and because we're changing, we're growing, we're maturing. And in that process, we encounter conflicts, right? So now we come back to a question we've already started to answer. Why do human beings give explanations? We've explained why we put those explanations in the form of stories, but why do we give accounts? Right? Let's be very clear, and this is really important. I've got two images of Socrates who saw philosophy as fundamentally the attempt to give a rational account or explanation of things that mattered to human beings, things that mattered most in their lives, like happiness, like virtue, like doing the right thing, being a decent human being. Well, we give accounts because we have the power of reason, or the Greek word is logos. And logos means speech and reasoning together, right? It's where we get our word logic. You think of like biology as the science or the logic of life, right? So logos has different shades of meaning, but here we're just talking about speech and reason. Why does speech and reason go together? Because the power of reasoning is made possible by a medium to reason in. A medium is like a tool that you use. Without speech, there's no reasoning, good or bad, or indifferent, right? The ability to speak allows us to use words that represent our experiences and represent our experiences to ourselves and to reflect on them, right? And therefore, to explain ourselves, explain the world to ourselves, or even ourselves to ourselves. I took this interesting class on consciousness, right? Our verbal, not part of it's verbal, part of it's not, but part of it is our verbal awareness of the world and ourselves. To be conscious. And some of the philosophers in this field of expertise say that consciousness is all made possible through language, or at least the type of consciousness human beings have, and that ourselves, literally ourself, like what am I? I'm more than a body. I'm a person with a certain essence that has been through certain things that if you just investigated my body with a microscope, you'd never find, right? So therefore, what I am is created to some extent by the stories I tell about myself when I reflect on my own experiences. And you think about that as the kind of ticker tape monologue that goes on in your head all the time that you don't necessarily share with other people. Okay, so Speech is the thing you use. It's the medium that you use to reason in. We are a symbolic species. We represent the world to ourselves in symbols, whether they're paintings, whether they're sculptures, whether they're words, whether they're music, right? We are constantly trying to reflect and make sense of the world. And of course, in the process, we don't just represent the world, we certainly create a world of our own, because the various media we use, painting, what have you, they have the power not only to represent the world, but to create a world up to a point. Obviously not the creative power that God has in the first 6 days of creation, in the 6 days of creation. Human beings are fundamentally curious. We want to understand, therefore we tell accounts. So we have this power of reasoning, this faculty of reasoning, the ability to know, the ability to understand. So what do we want to do? Because we have it, we want to use it. We want to understand the world out there. So we give explanations to ourselves and to others about what things are, or what the truth is, or what they mean. Okay. So why else do we tell accounts? Awe and wonder before the world. The ancient Greeks believed that philosophy, the desire to explain the nature of things to ourselves and to each other, was born out of a fundamental, you might even say childlike awe, the kind of the thrill, even the kind of sublime terror before the breadth of the world, the mystery of the world. The question, for example, you find in Heidegger, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing? Or if you've seen Woody Allen's Annie Hall, if the universe is expanding and the universe is everything, what is it expanding into, right? So these questions, they kind of boggle the mind, and what's boggling your mind are the phenomena of the world that seem to be beyond our full comprehension, right? But the moment something that seems beyond our full comprehension is the moment we desire to try to explain it to ourselves. So we're curious. Another important reason why we tell stories is because the world is chaotic. The world, it's not clear whether the world was made for us. The story of the Bible, in one sense, is that the world was made for us. Although, of course, once Adam and Eve get out, the world is not simply harmonious with their existence, which seems very much like the real world. So we should question about what the Bible is really telling us there. But if we think about one of the fundamental functions of religion, it's to provide an explanation in response to the awe of the world, but also to the threat that the world poses, because as human beings we seek order, we seek meaning, we seek coherence, we seek stability, and of course the world offers us none of these things. And therefore in the story you can have the clear beginning, middle, and end, where everything is kind of wrapped up with a bow and organized. Of course, however, if you read any great work of literature, a great author tends not to want to do that. They leave some of the problematic nature, the anarchic nature of the order of things in there, the unexpected, our lack of control over things. So we need order and coherence, and giving accounts exercises our natural powers. Okay, so we are rounding third base right now and heading for home, for those of you who have managed to watch a baseball game. We want to focus on the specific function of accounts historically, and account particularly focusing on myth, the ancient myth. The Greek word is mythos, right? What is the function of a myth? A story. A myth is a story about a people, right? And typically their origins, how they came to be who they are, right? And typically myths are narrative accounts narrative accounts designed to explain three key questions to us. Say, the Jews, the Christians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Muslims, take your pick, right? The Americans writing the great American novel. What would the great American novel do? It would explain ourselves to ourselves. So these myths form, they don't just describe the identity of a people, they form it through people's ritual contact with these texts. The three things a myth is determined to explain is, number one, what is all this? What is this world? That's why we've been talking about the world. What is this world that we're in? What is it like? How is it structured? What's in it? Right? Next question. Who are we? What are our values? What is our social structure? What is our belief system? Right? And then thirdly, in light of what this is, this whole thing, and in light of who we are, what is our relationship to the whole order of things? Right? So, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, there's a very interesting relationship, which on one hand, in the beginning, Adam and Eve are put in like the living room called Eden. And it's all made out for them, and it's engineered. They got a couch over here and a widescreen over there, and they don't have to work. And it's all groovy, man. And then they get booted out. And then their relationship to the world and each other fundamentally changes. Right? So this relationship deals with not just who we are, but also or our relationship to the world, but our relationship to each other. So the function of these myths, first to answer these three questions. And in addition, there's another function that I've been talking about all along, which is that we don't just make culture, culture in turn makes us. We don't just make accounts that describe who we are, the accounts make us, right? We make things that in turn make us. We make language, we make stories, we make history, we make ideas, art, technology, culture, computers, all these things we make, but then as we utilize them and internalize them, they shape our outlook, right? What is the function of compelling someone to go to church every Sunday, having them go through the rituals, having them their senses inundated by paintings or stained glass windows? What is the point of a Muslim being called to prayer 5 times a day? It is a kind of praxedoxy, praxis. You're forced to do things that habituate you to a certain way of life, and therefore a certain kind of psychic or spiritual attitude that starts to shape who you are, right? Shape who you are. So we've been talking about these things, but now I want to kind of formally spell it out. Now these are the first 2 key vocabulary terms you're going to have for your vocabulary quiz. I will have the terms listed in another PowerPoint, so because here they're just kind of isolated, and these are not all the terms, but these are terms of connecting in what we're talking about. There's 2 fundamental types of accounts. And these are 2 Greek words, and they're very important for our class because these are the 2 types of accounts in literature that we're going to see this semester. One is a mythos or a myth, and the other is a logos, or it's speech and reason, but a logos is also a rational account or explanation of something. So a myth, in Greek, the word myth, we have all these connotations of myth as kind of fantasy and this old-fashioned superstitious stuff. But myth literally means story or narrative account. And the key thing is it's an explanation that comes in the form of a story designed to explain the core mysteries of human experience because they're inexplicable and maybe ineffable. Myth answers these questions that we've just talked about. Who are we? What is this world? And what is our relationship to the world and each other? Myth appeals, this is important, myth appeals to the heart, to the emotions and the passions. it also appeals to the head. But the first impact of a story is felt, I think, more than it's cerebral, right? So if we think of the difference between myth, we could characterize as literature, or in the ancient world, myth is poetry, right? The poet writes because the poet is writing myths, and myth appeals to the head, and a rational account or philosophy appeals to the heart. So when we talk about myth and logos, or mythos and logos, we're actually talking about poetry and philosophy. This fundamental distinction made in ancient Greece. For them, they didn't use the word literature to describe drama, epic poetry, what we might consider a novel, dialogues. What they called it was poetry, right? Okay. We typically think of myth as fiction, but of course fiction is not complete make-believe either, right? Fiction describes things that didn't happen, but they describe things that could happen, and they describe things that things that often do happen. So we have to be careful thinking about fiction as like entertainment or make-believe, because fiction is always dealing with the world around us. It's just talking about a world that didn't literally happen as described. And I think we wouldn't engage in entertainment and books if we weren't actually getting basically an alternative form of experience through them. Okay, logos, a rational account, or we might think of a nonfiction account. But the big thing about a logos is it's rational, it's non-narrative, and it's determined to explain some phenomena of the world, bound by the procedures of logic and evidence, right? So myth is not bound by logic, and myth is not bound by evidence, right? You can make the land of make-believe. But a logos, a rational account, it tries to point to the concrete empirical world around us as evidence. And it must stay on the playing field of reason and logic. It can't contradict itself, for example. Right? And in the ancient world, when you think of logos, you think of philosophy. Philosophy, Plato, for example, really seems to understand his goal as a philosopher as to displace the authority of the poets like Homer, who had given the definitive accounts of the world, such that Plato, as a philosopher, would displace myth with logos. Displace myth with logos. And there's a kind of competition and a tension between poetry and philosophy. And it's, of course, complicated by the fact that if you've ever read Plato, he writes dramas. He actually is writing in a poetic form. Right? Now, as we conclude, we're like halfway down the third base line here. I want to look at the historical development of the primary or authoritative modes by which human beings have represented the world to themselves. There's one very negative or a pretty negative connotation of the word literature. Like, it's just words. It's just make-believe. It doesn't speak about the real world. Just kind of something stands alongside it, right? And that attitude we have about literature, kind of its irrelevance, has a lot to do with the overtaking of literature by other modes of explaining the world, right? If you're an ancient Greek and you're trying to understand the world, you turn to a philosophic logos, a philosophic account in words. If you're a Jew or a Christian and you turn for your definitive explanation to the world, you take out the Bible and you say the world is not out here, it's in here. You see the difference? And today, we take the authority of science as kind of the locus of the true explanation of reality or what have you. So in the ancient world, people got their explanation through stories. And of course you can see how powerful that is, right? Because stories have an appeal to the heart more than the head, and they're engaging. But the first attempts to really give comprehensive explanations of the reality of the world started in religious poetry, right? In the 7th century BC, Greece, at least the histories describe the first philosophers. Thales is considered the first Greek philosopher. And the Greek philosophers said, you know what? All these myths told by poets, this is a bunch of gobbledygook. There is, I'm sorry, there's no Zeus up there on Mount Olympus with a lightning bolt. That's irrational. I want a logos. I want a rational account of the world based on evidence and logic and reasoning. And the thing is, evidence and logic can be scrutinized by a third party. If I make a claim under philosophy, under the rubric of philosophy, I have to demonstrate it through the evidence and through the consistency of my logic. And if I haven't done that, it's not true, and the other person should discard it. Whereas myth, and particularly a revealed text like the Bible, says it's true because it's the Word of God. And the buck stops there. There's no pointing to external evidence or the consistency of logic, right? So Plato and the philosophers specifically intent on creating a more rational explanation of the world. And I don't necessarily mean better. I mean more rational. It has its advantages and disadvantages. It's interesting, after the development of philosophy in ancient Greece, you have the discipline, something like the early inklings of the modern academic discipline of history emerge in Herodotus and Thucydides. Which is to say, when Thucydides wrote his history of the Peloponnesian War, he was determined to be factually accurate. He understood the distinction, for example, between history and myth. Myth deals with history. It deals with the past, the origins of things, and their development to the present. But they're not concerned with empirical facts. If you want, the myth just takes up what other people have said about the past and writes it down as if it's fact. And in fact, Herodotus, that's what he did. He took stories of peoples around the Mediterranean. He's a Greek as well, Greek historian, considered the first historian. And he wasn't interested in fact-checking their stories. He was simply interested in what people told themselves about themselves and their own histories. And that's what mattered. Thucydides didn't want just what people said. He wanted to know what actually happened. And that what actually happened in his history mattered. And of course, that's the kind of history we see as doing ourselves today. History is about the facts of the past, and so on and so forth. So this understanding, or this mode of account, this logical form of account, this non-fiction form of account in philosophy and history, really dominated human beings' explanations of the world until the 17th century, when natural science, which used to be called natural philosophy, took hold. And the natural scientists of the scientific revolution were really determined to root their facts in and ground them in something that they thought would be unassailable. And there's a problem with these previous accounts. They come in language. Can language articulate the reality of the world with perfect fidelity? Right? So, for example, one thing natural science did, early on, it tried to explain things in words. And of course it still does that today, and there's a problem with that, and we're going to conclude with it. But Descartes came up with a brilliant idea that if we want to have a science that presents certain knowledge, number one, we're going to have a method. We're going to have a procedure by which we generate representations of the world. Ultimately what he's talking about there. Number one. Number two, the mode in which we're going to represent the world is in numbers, is in quantities, right? Words do much, much, much more than capture just quantities. They capture qualities. They capture ideas. A whole range of things are completely eliminated when you start describing the world in numbers. But the goal was to present something that could be considered perfectly factual knowledge. And why is this great? Because numbers and mathematics are the same in China as they are in Ethiopia, as they are in the United States. The numbers are the numbers are the numbers. There isn't Chinese math. There isn't North African math. There isn't Southeast Asian math. There's just math. It's the universal language. And the problem with all these previous modes of account is that they were not speaking in the universal language of mathematics. And also their object was ill-defined. And also they didn't have a rigorous method to guarantee that when they came up with an account, they were arriving at the truth. So you see, we move from fiction here to nonfiction. But of course, this raises the question, what's the real status of science in its ability to represent the world with perfect fidelity to the truth? So what's happened here in this trajectory from poetic texts going back 100,000 years ago? Well, that's before writing, but we're telling stories. And eventually, around 2000 BC, and 3000 BC, you get the first pictographs and first writing, and then eventually stories begin to get written down, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. And you see that poetics, religious poetry gets displaced by natural science as the authoritative account or explanation of our world, right? And, I mean, look at today, just an example with the coronavirus. The mantra is trust the science, trust the scientist. We could just raise the specter now. Does science answer the questions we as human beings have and need to have answered for our own lives to be meaningful and to have worth and significance? This is the question we're getting at. And my argument is science, who can be against science? Are you kidding me? Does science make the rocket go to the moon and get my car from point A to point B? Science is amazing. But what I'm arguing is, for all its explanatory power, for all the investigation it's done, because of its object, which is limited, as we'll see, and because of its mode of expression in mathematics, it's not capable of capturing those human meanings that we're really concerned with as human beings, which is why literature and poetry retain a fundamental place in our... They haven't become obsolete, right? Or antiquated is what I'm arguing here. So I want to raise a profound question here and a challenge. Our goal, or what we do as human beings, is give accounts. We give explanations. We represent the world. But how faithful can we be to the world in attempting to represent it? So on the left, at the top, we have the world. And we translate, when we represent things to ourselves, we represent them in a different form. That world is understood through a variety of things. And there's a process of translation. And how do we go about making this translation? And what does it mean when we're actually doing it? So what are the things we use to represent the world? Words, books, poetry, novels, textbooks, maps, paintings, sculptures, music, photographs, numbers, charts, and graphs. Right? Can all these things really capture the world? Right? Look at the world, right? And I'll give you an example. It's a very cheeky example from Pablo Picasso, one of his books. He's on a train, and he's sitting next to a man, and the man takes out a picture, and I guess he is, as all husbands are, they're in love with their wives, and he takes out the picture. He says, "This is a picture of my wife." And Picasso responds, "Excuse me, I blew the story." He says, "This is my wife." He says, he doesn't say this is a picture of my wife, he says this is my wife. And Picasso says, she's rather small and flat, right? Because the picture is not his wife, it's just a picture of his wife. And we enter the question of the way in which objects that represent the world have fidelity or lack fidelity to the world they're trying to represent. So we use pictures. I think the first mode of human beings representing the world to themselves were through pictures in caves from 40,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, and of course sculptures. Then we have words, and one way you could think about words are help us paint a picture of the world, but not in images, in ideas, right? And then, of course, modern science uses numbers to capture the world, right? Because they were particularly concerned to have a high degree of fidelity to the world. And so here's that great image from the Matrix with the ones and zeros trickling down. Because if anyone, you've all seen the Matrix, I hope it's a good movie, and all the human beings live in a virtual reality that feels like the actual world. It's just like this, and the guy eats the steak and drinks the wine, and it's wonderful, and he doesn't care that he's not really there, because it seems like it. But there are scenes that show what that computer-generated reality really is it all can be reduced to just ones and zeros, because of course you know everything on a computer, it's just a bunch of ones and zeros, right? That's the meaning of life, ones and zeros, right? And is that the whole picture? Okay, so what's our challenge here? Our goal is to communicate information about the world to ourselves and one another. And this is going to have some powerful implications for meaning and interpretation, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video, right? We learn about the world through our senses, right? We already have a lens or perspective of the five senses by which we can learn about things. And then, of course, the data from the senses sloshes around in our brains and our bodies, and we cogitate on it and manipulate it, right? And we have thoughts and words and images in our minds about the world. And the point is, the world, the actual thing, the words are only roughly equivalent to it. They're an imperfect approximation of our own experiences, right? And so this creates a fundamental challenge for communicating a kind of true account of the world in what we'd call natural language. Natural language is just the naturally, historically developing languages like English, French, Italian, as opposed to man-made languages like ones and zeros in computer programming, kind of self-consciously made for a specific purpose, where our language evolved over time kind of spontaneously. Okay, so you can see the problem for us communicating, right? And what do books do? They are essentially interpersonal communication between the author and the reader. And the problem is we both inhabit two different worlds of time and space, and in this case, of sex or gender, right? So I have my experience of the world, which isn't the total world. Really, I experience just a horizon, just a segment of the whole world. The man experiences his segment, right? And of course, you know, the woman sees the earth as Venus, and the man sees the earth as Mars, and yet they're both the earth, but they don't see it the same way because of, in this case, their gender, right? There's a, famous isn't the right word, but there's a well-known book called Women Are from Venus and Men Are from Mars. And so to capture this is kind of different. Like, they see the same reality, but they don't experience it the same way. And that comes out through our words and our communication, right? Novalis, this German 19th century poet, famously said, all communication is a form of miscommunication, which means we understand enough to have a general idea of what's being said, But we also know enough to know that we didn't understand everything that was being said, because the words of that person are coming from their experience of the world, which is different from our experience of the world. And therefore, there is a potential boundary between the two in attempting to create and communicate accounts of the world. So let's step through some of the important fundamental differences of these types of accounts in this process of the transformation, the historical transformation of authoritative accounts, right? Because I want you to understand what valence the Bible or Homer are operating. They're attempting to give a kind of comprehensive account of the world, right? The way science has been put in that position today, right? So poetry was the first way we tried to explain the world to ourselves. And it was almost always religious poetry, and there was no distinction, there was no other type of poetry. All poetry was intrinsically speaking about the gods and the supernatural forces of the world. As a genre, it was divinely inspired poetry. Myth was coming from prophets, epic poetry, tragic or comic drama, all different forms of poetry in the ancient world. The form, narrative in natural language. Epistemic mode. What do I mean by that? Epistemology has to do with how we know about the world, the tools and the faculties we use to make sense of it and to gain knowledge of it. So poetry of the ancient world claims to be divinely inspired. So I have an image on the top of Homer and on the bottom of Moses. Moses is considered to have written originally considered to have written the first five books of the Bible, right? And how did he come to write it? Well, it's the word of God. It's not his word. He's just a prophet or medium or vehicle for God's word, right? And likewise, Homer, when we look at the opening lines of Homer, we realize that he too claims to be kind of a mouthpiece for the gods, or the muse Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. So a very unusual relationship to the content of what they speak about. They claim that it's not their account, that it's a divine account, right? And obviously, if we read Homer, we see observations of the ordinary world that come through our senses and our mind. And the author, then, of this comprehensive account is a kind of prophet-poet or a poet-prophet, right? Examples, Homer, Moses, Virgil, so on and so forth. Then Greek philosophy comes along, and we see in Plato a very explicit intent to overcome and displace poetry as the authoritative explanation of things in society at large, like not just for his personal milieu, but like to displace poetry in explaining the world. The genre for Plato is the Philosophic Dialogue, and Aristotle uses a treatise. It's more like an essay format. The form is an explanation in natural language. The mode is to use reason, logic, deductive and inductive reasoning, and empirical observations or empirical evidence. The object is the natural world, the cosmos seen and unseen, which is to say, for Plato, there's certain things you see with your eyes, and there's certain things you see with your mind that your eyes don't see. Certain understandings you can only reach through working on the material of the senses. The author of this type of account is a philosopher, a historian, and those are your examples. But then, in the 17th century, the scientific revolution is determined to displace the philosopher's account and the poet's account of the world. And it's interesting, today, when we think of literature, we see poetry and philosophy being much closer together than, say, Plato did. And of course, you know, many people in this kind of postmodern world of ours will say, oh yeah, philosophy, that's just poetry, because that's all just, you know, philosophers just come up with shit, and they don't have to prove it in fact, they don't have to do a scientific experiment, right? And of course there's some general truth to that statement, that they're not always rooted. Even philosophers themselves are criticizing other philosophers for being like too pie in the sky in the clouds, and they have to come back down to the material realm. So here we have a whole bunch of important people from the 17th century scientists. They were called natural philosophers, right? Got Francis Bacon, Galileo, René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and Baruch Spinozza. So the genre is some type of scientific treatise that shows the results of investigations, empirical investigation. The important thing is that the form increasingly becomes mathematics as the language of the world. Epistemic mode is important. Scientific method. What does that do? It regularizes the way in which we achieve results that reflect observations of the world, so that when I do it and you do it, you come up with the same result. They use experiment, which means they actively investigate. They don't claim to know things in advance. Actually, science is predicated on knowledge of our own ignorance, that we don't know something in advance. And we have to go out and seek the information from the world through empirical evidence, logic, and induction. And the interesting thing is, science increasingly moves away from ordinary sense perception. Any novel, the Old Testament, literature, it almost always relies on our own bodily relationship with the world. We stand, we look out at the horizon, we smell, we taste, we touch, and that informs the qualitative experience of the world for us. That is an important part of literature, just depicting the beauty of sensual experience, right? Science increasingly observes the world, not through our senses, but through technology, through the microscope, through various types of measuring devices that start to remove our own bodies and our own qualitative experiences from the equation. And I use that as an apt pun here, right? So you lose something in science because it's determined to depict quantities and not the qualitative aspect of our experience. And I make an argument that this is why literature remains so vital as a mode or an account of truth or of reality. The object of the scientific world is the material world. And again, it's both seen and unseen, but in a different way from the Christians, let's say, and from the Greeks. The unseen world for a Christian is a spiritual realm of God, or the spiritual realm of heaven. The unseen world for Socrates is not a spiritual realm. It's the realm of the mind, that the mind is able to see certain relationships that don't physically exist before the eyes, but certainly have a palpable reality, right? Science, what is the unseen world? Well, think about radiation. Radiation is coursing through the air every second of the day, and you don't see it, but it's there. But you can have a special device that can pick up and recognize and measure the radiation that your body's not even aware exists, right? And of course, the author, the explainer of the world, is the scientist. And you might say today that the person who explains the human realm is the economist, right? And they actually bring together a lot of these different forces, elements of science, elements of philosophy, elements even of poetry and culture, to try to explain the mechanism of human society. And I want to go piece by piece looking at these characters to see what they gave us, because one of them, Baruch Spinozza, will have a particular impact on the way we actually understand literature. A scientist will have deeply and profoundly influenced our understanding of the Bible. So Francis Bacon, he wanted to eliminate, through some type of scientific method and experiment, the distortions of understanding that come from our biases and prejudices, right? Our subjective reality. And he has a metaphor of the human mind as like a curved mirror that naturally distorts things in the world. And that the goal of science would be to avoid the distorting effects of the mind through a procedure of reasoning and a procedure of an experiment that would neutralize those distortions or subjective reality. Of course, for us, we think of literature very often and art as portraying the subjective experience. So he is actually trying to extricate and filter out the very thing that we see as absolutely essential to our experience as human beings. He criticized book learning, right? The source of knowledge was not in books like the Bible. The source of knowledge was out in the world, to be observed. Next we have Galileo, who famously said that the book of the world is written in mathematics. The book of the world is written in mathematics. And therefore, if we want an authoritative count of it, we cannot turn to something like the Bible or Homer. We have to turn to numeric analyses and computations of the world. You measure it, right? That's the simple answer. You want to understand the world, you measure it in numbers. Descartes came along seeking in his discourse on the method and his meditations true and certain knowledge about the world. He wanted to make sure that scientific knowledge was really true. So he came up with the discourse on the method, a rigorous method, more rigorous than Bacon, by which knowledge could be gained and we'd have certainty that it was real knowledge. It was the truth, right? Knowledge implies you're knowing something that's true. If you know something that's false, you don't know it. You just have an opinion, right? And the way he did this was to conceive the world as matter and extension. Matter meaning physical stuff, and extension meaning like it's in space and it goes out and extends in 3 dimensions, right? And of course, Descartes is famous for the Cartesian Grid, because what is a Cartesian Grid? It maps out matter in space. Everything is just a plenum and a void. A plenum is a solid thing surrounded by empty space, right? And everything is just stuff. And all of a sudden, all the psychological or subjective or qualitative elements of our experience are stripped away as everything is reduced down to a measurable quantity. You can see why literature exists still today, because we need the quality of our experience depicted to us. Newton comes along and says everything's matter and motion, and that the whole story of the cosmos is not about, God creating heaven and earth and Jesus being resurrected and the second coming at the end of all time. He says the whole story of the cosmos is just matter and energy, right? Matter in motion and the 3 laws of thermodynamics, an equal and opposite reaction, and that's the whole story of the cosmos. A very different story than the story told in the Bible. We should say that all these scientists were also deeply religious, and they believed that their explanations explained the physical world, but they did leave room for there being another kind of dimension or a spiritual dimension of reality that couldn't be gleaned through empirical evidence. Lastly, we get to Baruch Spinozza, right? And he was really a fan of the scientific revolution. He accepted the basic principles of it. He was deeply influenced by René Descartes' discourse and his meditation, in which he conceives everything as basically matter in motion, matter and energy, and that constitutes the totality of what exists. For our purpose, what Spinoza did was to take this scientific attitude and apply it to literature in order to, you could say, critique it or bring it before the tribunal of natural science and determine its validity, right? And he writes this very important work, it's still very important today, the Theologico-Political Tractatus, in which the particular literature that he brings before the tribunal of science, modern science, is the Bible itself, right? And he initiates with this text the modern school of what is called the historical criticism of the Bible. And the historical criticism of the Bible denies the divinely inspired origins of the Bible. We looked at the ancient poet and Moses. They are prophets. They are inspired, meaning they're inspired with the word of God. And that's what the book is, a divinely inspired word of God. And Spinoza turns around and says, it's not divinely inspired. It's not the product of something outside of time and space, a spiritual entity like God. It's a product of this world. It's a product of history. And it's a product of the history of people who wrote these stories down and edited them and so on. He denied that Moses was the author of the first 5 books, which is a commonplace conclusion of modern scholarship. And furthermore, the Bible was not the work of one author, but of roughly 4 authors. And he looked at the text and saw kind of ruptures and different styles within it. He treated the Bible as a historical work, right? It's the product of the mind of man, not the mind of God, and therefore reflects the needs and desires of men, not God's will, right? So he treated the Bible like any other material object. He treated it like science would treat any other physical object. It's a product. It's an empirical thing, and therefore it's a product of empirical or material or physical forces, and nothing else, right? And so Spinoza for us sits on a boundary, right? Because the moment the Bible is no longer understood as divinely inspired, does that mean it loses all its meaning? The answer is absolutely not. It's the moment that the Bible becomes literature, which is to say, a work of literature to be appreciated for its wisdom, to be appreciated for its reasoning, to be appreciated for the beauty and sublimity of its stories, but not to be treated as literally the Word of God, right? So when we start to move on to, say, Genesis and Job, we're going to address this kind of razor's edge or this fence between a text that's divinely inspired versus a text that actually reflects the wisdom of human beings, right? Is this book the wisdom of God? The wisdom of human beings? Interesting question. Okay, but you can, so, to finish here, what's the problem with science? Well, we hear the politicians today. I'll trust the science. Well, the first problem is science generates a whole bunch of measurements. Okay, right? But science does not claim, the Bible claims to present authoritative, ultimate truth, right? Science actually doesn't claim that. Science claims that it is a perpetual process of investigation with a uniform method. And if we investigate and get a new result, what we do is modify our previous understanding, right? Science, by definition, does not assume that it's correct, right? But it's interesting, in our day, science is a prejudice. It is a bias, right? There was a very interesting interview that David Letterman did on a late-night show with a guy named Edward Bernays, who was like the father of the public relations and advertising industry in the United States. And he actually was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And public relations was all about understanding people's psychology and how to manipulate it, for advertising. First, like, you want to get them to buy something that you want them to buy. And the one thing he did was, in a kind of a very American way, he translated the centrality of the libido and sexuality in Freud as one of the central psychic motors of human life into advertising. He said, let's put it in a simplistic way, if sex is on everybody's mind and everybody wants it, I will sell things by using sex. So we all know that expression, sex sells, where Edward Bernays was really the guy who took that to the bank, literally and figuratively. Okay, so he came on David Letterman, and David Letterman says, Dr. Bernays, it's wonderful to meet you. He says, explain what you do exactly. What is public relations all about? And he says, public relations, he's got this German accent, public relations is all about the concept that if you call me doctor, I will have more credibility with your audience. right? So who do we put all our faith in today? The scientists, right? But science doesn't generate permanent answers. And also, the true meaning of science repudiates science as an authority simply because it said something, right? There's this famous expression in Latin coming out of medieval theology, ipse dixit. He said it himself. And it's often kind of translated as the philosopher said. So, in medieval times, if you wanted to know like what the truth of something was, it was whatever Aristotle had said, right? Or for religious, it's whatever, say, a religious text had said. You don't need to look at the empirical evidence. Therefore, the text had its own authority simply because it had said it and who it was purportedly coming from, aka God, right? So, our scientists are not God. When they speak, they don't necessarily, what they say, the validity of what they say is not based on their own authority, it's supposed to be based on their science. But we're in an interesting moment in which the authority of scientists is not based on necessarily evidence, but because it's a scientist saying it, right? So here's the other challenge to science. It gives things in quantities, numbers. And if you've read or are aware of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it says toward the end of the book that the meaning of everything is 42. Right? The meaning of everything is 42. So what's the problem with accounts in the form of number and quantity as the language of the world? So at the end of the Hitchhiker's Guide, the two main characters travel to an unknown planet. Sounds kind of like our planet, but it's a little different. There they learn that a race of hyper-intelligent pan-dimensional beings create a supercomputer named Deep Thought to determine the answer to the ultimate question to life, the universe, and everything. Well, first of all, what is the question? I don't know. What is the meaning of it all, I think, is what they're really asking. The ultimate question of life, or the question of the universe, is what is it all about? What is the meaning of it all? And Deep Thought, this supercomputer, operating in ones and zeros, to come back to the language of science, computers operate in numbers, big data, numbers. And Deep Thought gives the answer, 42. It's all solved. I can die now. My life has been fulfilled. 42. Well, what's the problem with an answer? What the hell does that mean, and what does it have to do with me on planet Earth? Right? 42 what? What are we talking about? Right? And what I'm pointing out here, I'm asking these kind of absurd questions, is these questions illuminate the limitations of the mathematical language of the world. Right? Economics hopes to describe human behavior in numbers. But then economics also talks about things like animal spirits, which is some kind of poetic, psychological, it's not quite gobbledygook, about why people act the way they act, because they can't explain it in numbers. We haven't quantified human existence just yet, thank God, but big data is on its way there. Let me ask these questions. Is 42 a little or a lot? Is it good or is it bad? Is it beautiful or is it ugly? Is it funny or is it sad? Is it boring or is it interesting? And all these questions, number one, we're asking about things that really matter to us. The things that matter to us are the issues of good and bad, ugly and beautiful, just and unjust, things of that nature, boring or interesting. And when we're asking these questions of the number 42, what we're really asking is, what the hell does it really mean? And what that says is that the number 42 by itself does not mean anything to us, right? And it is, meaning is the thing we want. And the thing is, meaning comes from natural language. Meaning comes from English. Meaning comes from explanations in ordinary speech, is what I'm saying. Furthermore, in mathematics, when you get a number, you then have to, where does meaning come from? It comes from interpretation. When we interpret something, we get a meaning from it. So even when a scientist gets 42 of whatever, they then have to translate that number into words to explain its meaning to us, its significance, its impact, right? Coronavirus today, 42. Well, should we be happy? Should we be sad? Should we be fearful? Should we be relieved? Should we go back to school? Should we stay at home with 42? Well, we need an explanation in words that ties back in with these issues here, right? And variations of those issues, right? So, am I preaching against science? Absolutely not. I'm saying that science does offer the authoritative account of the physical world, but it has not mastered all of it, and it has not mastered what it's like for a human being to be a human being in the world and to deal with the questions it has about the world, right? And where are we going to seek out those questions and their answers? We're going to find it in literature.